as we bring on Cory Smith, editor of Pack Pride, to preview this game from an NC State perspective. Cory, we appreciate you joining us, and it's a situation where Syracuse has been struggling. Obviously, it seems like NC State is playing its best basketball of the season. Is that fair to say? They've won 2 or 3. I know it's BC, but just picked up a big win over Wake Forest. Would you agree this team's playing its best basketball right now?
Yeah, I mean, at least the most consistent basketball from start to finish. I mean, you guys talked about it, the fact that there's been multiple area games where Syracuse has been good enough to be able to win games in the first half and then struggle late in the second half. That's what NC State did early on in the season. You think back to those Virginia Tech games. They win those. We're not talking about how important this game is. We're talking about NC State trying to battle for seeding as opposed to trying to battle to get into the ACC tournament. So, yeah, they're playing much better basketball right now. The Boston College win didn't seem like that big of a deal, but Boston College has won 2 straight since then to keep pace in the ACC tournament standings or try to get into the ACC tournament, essentially. And NC State this past weekend beating a Wake Forest team that was, just as hungry as NC State. That Wake Forest team is battling to get into the NCAA tournament and still being kind of on the outside looking in now at this point. So they needed that win to keep pace in the ACC, and then you get it over an in-state team that's as hungry as they are. That's a huge confidence boost for this team, especially heading into a Syracuse game where they desperately need this win.
How is this year sitting with the NC State fan base? It hasn't been pretty up here, but NC State coming off the Final Four. How is this year sitting with the fan base?
Not well. You're coming off of a season where, look, it wasn't a great overall season last year when you look at the actual regular season, but, this is a team that won 9 straight to win an ACC championship and a Final Four last year. So the expectations coming into this year were, not necessarily to do that again, because that's not the expectation year in and year out for NC State, but to at least build upon that, be an NCAA tournament team, get to, the top half of the ACC at the very least. For this team to be right now, 16th in the ACC and battling to get into the ACC tournament, being potentially the first team ever, which, obviously it hadn't happened in the past. You weren't cut from the ACC tournament, but being the first team ever to win an ACC championship the year prior and not even go to it the next year, that would be extremely humbling for NC State and quite frankly, embarrassing. And I think that's kind of where the NC State fan base is heading into these last 4 games, win or lose. It's a frustrating season, but at least being able to save face a little bit by trying to make it to the ACC tournament would be massive.
Sounds very
familiar. Just going to say that, and there's a lot of talk up here, Cory, about is Adrian Autry on the hot seat and how hot is his seat and his future here. I know Kevin Keatts. It sounds crazy, right? He's coming off of a Final Four, but going into that postseason last year, he was on the hot seat, and then they go on that run through the ACC tournament and then the NCAA. What is his job security like down there in Raleigh?
Yeah, you expected the honeymoon phase to be a little bit longer than 1 year, right? But when you only win 4 games so far in ACC play, and you needed wins over Boston College and Notre Dame, 2 teams that are not very good in ACC play, to be able to get there, it's not a great look. I don't know exactly how hot the seat is right now, because there are still some that say, well, the contract is for 5 additional years. He built up enough goodwill last year by winning an ACC championship, something that hadn't been done in 37 years, going to the Final Four, something that hadn't been done in 41 years for NC State. So those things should be able to, give you a little bit of a grace period, but the fact that there could potentially be 20 plus losses, and that might be, the second time that that's happened in the last 4 years, that's kind of what's creeping up against Kevin Keatts right now is, yes, you did all the right things at the end of last season, but the consistent success still hasn't been there. And this year is yet another example of the fact that it just hasn't been there for Kevin Keatts. Win, lose, or draw here. The fact that for NC State to not be at least in the top half of the ACC after what happened last year, it's just kind of another indictment on Kevin Keatts and what he's built as a program.
What's been the biggest reason for that then, Cory? Because you pointed out early on in this interview about the losing a lot of close games. What's the reason, I guess, big picture for the record? Is it a poorly constructed roster? Did they strike out in the portal? Has it been injuries? What's the biggest reason in your mind for why this season went south?
Yeah, it's been a combination of several things. First of all, not that NC State fans want to talk about this, but Mike James, the kid that came over from Louisville, the expectation was for him to be kind of the centerpiece of this offense, be that guy at the three for you that's a physical guard, somebody that can rebound the basketball well and shoot from outside. And he hasn't played a single game all season long. He's been out the entire season with a knee injury that was scoped before the season started, and he hasn't been able to contribute at all. Also, the fact that there was some missed evaluations in the transfer portal. Brandon Huntley-Hatfield that came over from Louisville hasn't been what they expected. Ben Middlebrooks, despite looking good early on in the season, hasn't been great during ACC play, actually shooting less than 40% on the season or in ACC play. And as a big man, that's not what you need. You need at least consistent scoring down low and a guy that can rebound the basketball for you, and you've gotten next to nothing out of that. And then, the third thing here, the fact that, for NC State and for Kevin Keatts, part of the indictment on him is the fact that there's been players that have shown you that they're good enough to be able to compete and try to get wins for you. A Trey Parker, who's a true freshman, a Paul McNeil, who's a true freshman, and those two guys really haven't gotten consistent minutes on the court. Trey Parker showed out really well against Duke and Stanford, but hasn't played much in recent games. And then, Paul McNeil, a guy that everybody's been crying for the entire season, like, hey, this guy needs to be out there on the court for you. Well, he just finally got his first start this past game and showed out 24 points against Wake Forest, and had the best performance of basically any player all season, I would argue, in a critical situation. And now it's like, all right, well, where's this guy been all year? And I think that's part of the question marks for Kevin Keatts is that personnel, the way that he's, kind of rotated guys in and out. It hasn't been consistent enough, and you haven't been able to see what you have from some of the younger players as well.
Where does NC State fall when we talk about this? Where does NC State fall when you come to roster building in the NIL department? Because Syracuse is, we don't know if it's true or not, but the excuse is that they built a bad roster with NIL. How is NC State situated amongst ACC schools?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers aren't exact, so we don't know exactly what everything looks like. But, as far as roster construction, I think part of the frustration for Kevin Keatts in this administration was the fact that, you needed more NIL this past offseason. You got an ACC championship. You got to the Final Four. There was some hope that, all right, the same people that wanted Kevin Keatts out would now invest in NIL and get you to that point. Well, it was about 25% growth, but last year's roster, was built on less than $2 million. And so 25% growth was not that significant when it comes to needing to go out and get, 10 plus players on the roster. So as far as where they rank in the ACC, I would probably put them, in the back half of the ACC, even still after what they did last year. So, part of the frustration for NC State is the fact that you weren't able to, build upon what you had last year. And I think when you look at where they are in terms of the NIL landscape for the ACC, even, it's not nearly enough to be able to put together what Kevin Keatts wanted. They missed out on some really big prospects. The two of their top prospects ended up going to Xavier and Utah, and you ended up losing out to those programs when it comes to NIL, and that should be an eye opener. But instead everybody's kind of going, well, they weren't able to do what they needed to do on the court. Well, they did, and then you didn't actually end up backing them.
We look at NC State's road record. They have not won a true road game all year, but you look deeper and 3-point loss at Virginia, 3-point loss at Virginia Tech, 1-point loss at Stanford. They gave Duke at Cameron one of their toughest games all season in conference. So with all that being said, Cory, as you look at this matchup tonight on the road inside the Dome, lay it out for us from an NC State perspective, how the Wolfpack comes out with a win.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for them is to be able to come out the same way they did in the first half of the last few home games. Boston College, you go back to that one, they started off with, I can't remember exactly how much it was, but I want to say it was like 12 or 13-0 run to start that one. The same thing against Wake Forest this past weekend. They started off with an 11-0 run before Wake Forest got back into it. The biggest thing is going to be finishing the game, though. I talked about it earlier. Virginia Tech, you bring up those two games. They had double-digit leads in the second half. I mean, I believe it was 13 points against Virginia, like 15 points against Virginia Tech, and they allowed both of those teams to come back and win those games. So for NC State, it's about finishing this game. It's about, finding ways to close out the game, which is exactly what they did against Wake Forest. Wake Forest came back in that game, actually took a lead by 5 points midway through that one. And I mentioned him earlier, Paul McNeil comes in, he makes some clutch plays, saving a ball from going out of bounds that ends up leading to a big three that sparked a run. Then he hits a three-pointer late, hits some free throws late to be able to put that game away. So you have to make winning plays at the end of the game to be able to close things out. And that's something that NC State has struggled with on the road. We'll see if that momentum from Saturday can carry over. And that's exactly what they need to do against Syracuse tonight.
All right, a really big game for both of these programs. ACC tournament spot seems to be on the line for the winners. So you got a final comment, Paulie, now that you...
Well, I'm looking at the chat, and someone in the chat does not get what happened in NIL in the past 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Last year's NC State team would have cost way more than the $2 million that they had this year, right? If you wanted to keep those players, NIL exploded this offseason, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
See, it's not rocket ship science.
Well, and
go ahead.
I was going to say part of it for NC State last year was you built that roster based off of guys that were coming back from the previous season. DJ Burns was your highest paid player. He came over from Winthrop previously. You look at a guy like DJ Horn came in that was an in-state guy from Raleigh, from the area. So some of these guys took, I guess you could call them sweetheart deals, hometown deals basically to stay with NC State. You didn't really get that as much this offseason. And so they went out and they tried to get guys that they tried to basically, swing above their weight class and try to go get guys that you think could come in and lift the ceiling of the program, or at least the floor of the program. And they miss on several of those guys because they didn't get the NIL backing. So yeah, it's a weird situation, but it all leads to tonight where both these teams are competing to try to get to the ACC tournament. I believe the winner tonight gets an over 80% chance to make it. At that point, if you lose tonight, it's a massive swing because I take that back. Actually, I think if you lose tonight, you have an 80% chance to miss it. If you win tonight, both teams, I think for NC State, you have about a 25% chance of making it. For Syracuse, it'd be an over 40% chance of making it if you win this game tonight.
Yeah, it's a big one for both these teams, no doubt about it. Cory, we really do appreciate the time. Thanks so much for coming on. We look forward to chatting with you again when NC State rolls around.
Appreciate you guys.
All right, Cory Smith, editor for Pack Pride, and with that, we'll hit a timeout. We'll get to today's business on the other side. Back after this.